Hello viewers, you're welcome to this video where I'll be talking about epithelial tissues. Straight to the point, what's a tissue? A tissue is said to be a collection of cells, so a group of cells that play a common function or perform a common function. In other words, you could have many cells with individual roles. However, these cells will work together in such a way that together they have a common role. So when cells work like that to achieve a common purpose, they form what we refer to as a tissue. Now, from first principles, we know that there are four main types of tissues. We call them the cement tissues, C, M, E, and N. And if you watched my video on organogenesis, you'd hear something about this. Now, C stands for connective tissues. Then M is muscular tissue or muscle tissue. And then E is epithelial tissues. And then N is nervous tissue. So those are the four basic types of tissues. But of all of them, the most tissue of them, as it were, that is the one that is the most typical of tissues, is the epithelial tissues. And in terms of where they come from, which is partly the reason for my initial statement, nervous tissue is known to come from ectoderm. So nervous tissue is ectodermal in origin. Then for connective tissue and muscular tissue, they are known to come from mesoderm, if you remember the three germ layers. But for epithelial tissues, they are known to come from all three germ layers. So truly, they are a perfect representation of the term tissue. Now, epithelial tissues are of two major types. Some of them are called, that is one group now, the covering epithelia. And then we have the other group, the glandular epithelia. Now here's the idea. Epithelial tissues, wherever they occur in the human body, what they are known to do is to line surfaces and line passages. Like if you have a tube, the inside of that tube would most likely be lined by epithelial tissues. And then in some cases, you have surfaces that are lined by epithelial tissues. So epithelial tissues are lining tissues. They line surfaces and they line passages. But for some of them, apart from this lining or covering that they do, they have the ability to secrete substances. They have the ability of producing chemicals. So those ones that have the ability to secrete or to produce chemicals, we refer to them as glandular epithelia. Whereas the ones that are just for covering or lining, we refer to them as covering epithelia. So epithelial tissues are lining tissues. But where they carry out that lining, they may or may not produce chemicals, which is what differentiates covering epithelia from glandular epithelia. In the second part of this epithelial tissues video, I'll talk about glandular epithelia. I'll try to be as brief as possible because it's one aspect of biology that's a bit broad. So, facing covering epithelia in this first video, I would like to tell us that where covering epithelia occur in the human body or in the body of most animals, they occur in such a way that this is the epithelium and this is the surface that is to be lined by the epithelium. Now, between that epithelium and the surface, there's usually a layer of tissue that we refer to as the basement membrane. Basement membrane, which means in effect that the basement membrane can be seen as a layer of tissue that separates epithelial cells from the surface they are lining. Or we could picture the basement membrane as a foundation, as a platform on which the epithelial cells would rest. But irrespective of how you see it, just understand that the basement membrane, yes, carries the epithelial cells, at the same time separates them from the underlying tissue, that is the surface that they are overlying. So having said that, having mentioned that about the basement membrane, For covering epithelia, we'll talk about these special forms, pseudostratified, ciliated, and transitional epithelia. But for now, the two types of covering epithelia that we have are simple covering epithelia and stratified covering epithelia. By the way, I've been saying epithelia, whereas what we have there is epithelium. Epithelium is singular, but epithelia is plural. So simple epithelia and stratified epithelia, what's the difference? In simple terms, I'll tell you that the difference between simple and stratified epithelia is the number of cell layers. The number of cell layers. So it is the number of cell layers that differentiates simple from stratified. We can illustrate this. There are some houses that you have this way. Here is the ground, and there you have the house on the ground. Such ones are usually referred to as bungalows. They don't have stories. But there are some other houses. Here is the ground. You have the house like that. Then you have another floor on it. Then you have another one on it. In this case, you have layers. So this is like a simple house, while that is a stratified house. After all, the word stratified appears to have been derived from the word strata or stratum. And what do we mean by stratum? Layers. So when you talk about stratified epithelium and simple epithelium, the difference is that in simple epithelium, while this is the basement membrane, you have only one layer of cells. So we say simple epithelium is one cell thick, just one layer of cells on the basement membrane. But for stratified epithelium, you have a layer of cells on the basement membrane, then another layer of cells on top the initial layer, and so forth. So you can have multiple layers, such is referred to as stratified. Focusing on simple epithelium first. Simple epithelium may be squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. And what's the difference between these three types of simple epithelium? It's about the shape of the cells mainly. Like the term squamous. Squamous carries the idea of flat. By the way, squamous epithelium is also called pavement epithelium. So in case you hear of pavement epithelium, it's another name for squamous epithelium. And when you say something is squamous, like I said before, it means that that thing is flat. So when you see squamous epithelium, this is the basement membrane, you'll find the cells to be this way. They are very flat. They are flat cells. They are not risen at all. They don't come up from the basement membrane. So they are flat cells like this. In other words, the cells are longer than they are high, or their length or width is greater than their height. And their nucleus is shaped similarly too. See the nucleus. The nucleus appears to be oblong. The nucleus appears to be flattened and stretched from left to right. So the nucleus is flattened like that, of course, to match the shape of the cell itself. So this is how the nuclei appear. So this is what squamous epithelium is like. And you would appreciate this more when you see diagrams of the others. So I'll show you what cuboidal is like. Cuboidal epithelium, this is the basement membrane again. And then this time, see the epithelial cells. They are just like this. And this time around, if you compare what you have now to what we drew before, you'll see that in this case, it can be said that the cells are as wide as they are tall. That is, their width and their height are just about the same. So when you have their width and their height just about the same, that resembles a cuboid. And what about the nucleus? What is it like? The nucleus is at the center and is rounded. So that's how you have the nucleus. So compared with this one, If you look at this now, it appears to be like a pressed version of that. If you were to press this down, you'd get something like this. And of course, the pressing will not just affect the overall cell, but will affect the nucleus. All right. So this is what we call cuboidal epithelium. Then for the third one, which is columnar epithelium. Columnar epithelium would be something like this. Now, if you compare this to the other two that we've seen, you realize that for columnar epithelium, the cells are taller than they are wide. In other words, their height is way greater than what now? Their width. So they're not wide, they're just tall. They are like columns, as it were. And where is their nucleus located? The nucleus is usually at the base of the cell. And it's not just at the base, its shape matches the shape of the cell itself, which means the nucleus will be elongated like this. All right, which is the opposite of this, like raising this up. And then also remember that it's at the base of the cell. It's at the bottom there. So you have this one, see the nucleus, see that one, see the nucleus, and then the last one there with the nucleus. So what you are seeing on the board, if you look at these three now, this is squamous, that's cuboidal, and that's columnar. What's the difference? Height to width ratio. Here, width is greater than height. There, height is greater than width. Here, height and width are just about the same. Okay, so having shown those three types, we look at this side now, stratified epithelium, and you'd see that the types are just the same types we have here, which means there is stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. But I tell you, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar are not very common. They are rare. Yeah, those two types of epithelia are rare. What is more common is stratified squamous. And even the stratified squamous we are talking about, please note that it is not necessarily made up of squamous all through like this. Like first layer of squamous, second layer of squamous, third layer of squamous, and so on. No. Instead, what you have is a case where you have columnar or cuboidal making contact with the basement membrane. Then at the very top, so imagine this columnar having another columnar on top, maybe a third columnar, and then after this third columnar, there is squamous on top. This is stratified to begin with. Why is it stratified? Because we have multiple layers of cells. But stratified, what would it be out of these three? Stratified squamous. Why? Because the cells on top are squamous cells. So that's stratified squamous. Can we have stratified where columnar or cuboidal will be on top? Yes, but very rarely. What is more common for stratified epithelium is to have squamous on top. So somehow we have seen the difference between simple epithelium and stratified epithelium. And I said whether for simple or for stratified, you would always have squamous, cuboidal, and columnar as the three types. Before I talk about those special ones, one question we could ask ourselves is, where can we find these different types of epithelia that we have mentioned? Starting with squamous epithelium. Squamous epithelium can be found in the mouth. That's one place. So if you remember, it is flat. If you look at the shape of the cell, you look at a mouth also, you see that flat or squamous nature of the mouth. So that helps you remember that the mouth and even the vagina has squamous epithelium. The esophagus, blood vessels. So blood vessels are also an example. And then in the heart and in the lungs, you have squamous epithelium. So squamous epithelium is in all of these regions. Then for cuboidal epithelium, the best place to find them is in the glands. So think of the glands, the sweat glands, the mammary glands, the sebaceous glands, several other glands. You have cuboidal epithelium there. Then you also have cuboidal epithelium in the ducts of glands, the ducts. You know, most glands or many glands have ducts. There are also glands that do not have ducts. We'll talk about that in the next video. So ductless glands and then the glands that have ducts, the exocrine glands. And then another important place where you find cuboidal epithelium is in the germinal epithelium. Germinal epithelium. What do you mean by germinal epithelium? That's the lining on the gonads where the germ cells are located. Germ cells are the precursors of the gametes. They are the cells from which the gametes are formed. So these germ cells are found in the germinal epithelium, and that germinal epithelium is usually made up of what type of epithelial cells now? Yeah, cuboidal, that's the correct thing. Then for columnar epithelium, when you are to talk about columnar, it is best to just think of the digestive system. Think of the digestive system, think of the intestines, think of the anus, think of several other parts of the digestive system like that. So the digestive tract, much of what you have there is columnar epithelium. And then in the respiratory tract, like in the bronchi, in the bronchioles, in the nose, we have columnar epithelium. So columnar epithelium is found in several other places like that in the body. Now for these special forms that I mentioned here, they are modifications that occur mainly in columnar epithelium. Columnar is the one that undergoes many of these modifications that we have listed here. So it's hard to say pseudostratified squamous or pseudostratified cuboidal. What you find is pseudostratified columnar. So what's the meaning of pseudostratified? Pseudo means false. That is in addition to stratified now. So we use pseudostratified to describe epithelium that looks stratified when in reality it is not stratified. So sometimes you have the basement membrane like this, and you could have an epithelium this way. Let's say you have something like that. It becomes like the whole thing is stratified, you know, like look at this now, beautiful. If you look at this, it will appear like, let me adjust this point a little to match what we're trying to show. Beautiful. If you look at this, here it appears like you have one cell, and then this is another cell sitting on top of it. Whereas in reality, if you check well, you discover that this one cell, this particular cell I'm pointing at here, this one that I'm marking, goes all the way from the top to the basement membrane. It is not sitting on that other cell. Same as this one. It goes from the top all the way to the basement membrane. So in pseudostratified epithelium, the shape of the cells is a bit distorted, such that if you don't check carefully, you would think that what you have there is stratified epithelium. But when you trace each cell, you discover that each of them arises directly from the basement membrane and does not sit on any other cell. And that confirms that they are not stratified, but actually what? Pseudostratified columnar cells. What is more, remember that columnar cells usually have their nucleus at the base. So that's another thing that can give away pseudostratified epithelium. When you look for the nucleus, if this were really another cell seated on this one, where would the nucleus be? You don't find the nucleus. And if you were to see the nucleus, you'd have to trace it down here to see the nucleus. So the position of the nucleus can help you see pseudostratified as pseudostratified. Then for ciliated epithelium, ciliated is when you have columnar epithelium like this. Like I said, it usually applies to columnar epithelium. So this is columnar epithelium, and then it will have small projections like this on top of it. Those things are called cilia. And what's the essence of cilia? If you remember organisms that you found with cilia before, like paramecia or the paramecium has cilia, and this cilia, as they beat, they are able to perform movements or bring about movements. So there are some parts of the human body too where we need such cilia, like in the respiratory tract, to beat mucus upwards so that they can be expelled. What you have there is ciliated columnar epithelium. Then also in places like the epididymis of the male, or in the fallopian tube of the female, even in the uterus of the female. So the female uterus, the fallopian tube, the what else now? I talked about the epididymis in males. These are regions where materials are produced and need to be propelled. So in such areas, the epithelium you find is columnus ciliated or ciliated columnar. And then for transitional epithelium, anywhere that epithelial tissues have the ability to change shape or to distort their shape in response to prevailing conditions, the epithelium is said to be transitional. So transitional epithelium is epithelium that is amenable to change, amenable to a change in shape. They can change, they can be deformed, go from one form to another, just alter their shapes to suit their function. Where do we find transitional epithelium in the human body? You can find transitional epithelium in the renal calyces. When we say the renal calyces, if you remember what the structure of the kidney is like, in the internal structure, you find the calyces around the pyramid there, from where urine comes out of the main body of the kidney. And then beyond the calyces, you also have transitional epithelium in the ureters, in the bladder, as well as in the urethra. So all of these are regions where you have transitional epithelium, because at some point there will be the need for the tissue to expand, for the duct to expand. Like the bladder, when it becomes full of urine or filled with urine, it expands, it changes shape. So in such regions, the type of epithelium we have or we need is epithelium that can allow a change in its shape to adapt it to its function. So that's a brief on types of epithelial cells. And in the next video, I'm going to tell you about glandular epithelia. I'll talk about the types of glands that we have, the endocrine, the exocrine, and then we'll classify exocrine glands on different bases. I'll see us in that video, which would come after the break.